So welcome everyone. My name is Jeremy Rutledge, and I'm the senior pastor at the Circular Congregational Church, member congregation of the United Church of Christ here in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. And it's just my delight to welcome you to this year's Circular Church Fall Lectures in Theology and Ethics. Our fall lectures were begun in 2015 with a series of lectures held between Circular Congregational Church and the Charity Missionary Baptist Church, featuring Professor James Cone. We call his name tonight in the hope that our time together will challenge and inspire us with good theology that leads to liberating action. These lectures are made possible by the Circular Congregational Church Endowment. The endowment underwrites these lectures in order to make them free and available to all. And in that spirit, we hope you will freely share them, and we offer our thanks to the endowment. Many others have worked to make this event possible, including especially Catherine Cullinan, our church administrator, and Tyler Ung, our associate pastor. They've worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help us with the technology. To that end, our lectures tonight and tomorrow will be live streamed on Facebook, with recordings later posted to the Circular Congregational Church YouTube channel. I might also add that additional lectures can be found on our website. And if you'd like to learn more about the lecture series, either the lectures we've had in the past or what may be upcoming, you can email us at lectures@circularchurch.org. That list is only for lectures and for nothing else. But if you'd like more good theology, just send us an email at lectures@circularchurch.org. With regard to this evening's format, after a brief introduction, Amy will present on faith and public life for about 35 minutes or so, after which you're invited to join the conversation by asking questions in the comments section on Facebook, and I will do my best to moderate those comments and to get them to Amy. Thanks for all of you for bearing with us as we learn this new technology and experiment with ways to connect with each other. So let me offer a brief introduction. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome the Reverend Dr. Amy Butler, Pastor Amy, as our distinguished guest lecturer in theology and ethics. Amy is the interim senior pastor of the National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C. Amy has served 3 other vibrant congregations in her ministry: the St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church in New Orleans, the Calvary Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., and the Riverside Church in the city of New York. At both Calvary and Riverside, Amy was the first woman to serve as senior pastor. Amy is one of the finest preachers in the country, and she voices a prophetic and progressive Christian faith deeply relevant to our times. When thinking about faith and politics, we could have no better guide. Most importantly, of course, Amy is a daughter of Hawaii. She brings to her life and work an aloha spirit that we can feel in both the warmth of her words and her challenge to us. Drawing on the strength of Hawaiian matriarchal culture and the beauty of the natural world into which she was born, Amy speaks of a God and a politics that summon us to a healthier relation with the whole and a deeper, more relevant faith. Friends, I'm so glad that Amy is here with us tonight. Normally, I would invite you to join me in offering a warm Charleston welcome, but this evening, I invite you to join me in offering a warm welcome from wherever you are to my friend and our teacher, the Reverend Dr. Amy Butler. Welcome,
Jeremy.
Amy.
Thank you so much. That was so lovely. And I would like to welcome you to my dining room table, which has on it a computer, an iPad, a phone, and I'm going to do my best, as we all are in this moment, to engage in conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and for being open to my desire to talk about some of these things. I think tonight and tomorrow night, we're going to be wrestling with some really hard topics that are all centered around God and politics. I think this is not generally a conversation most of us like to have in normal life, or at least our parents told us it wasn't polite. But right now it's even more intense. So just want to acknowledge that and say that that is exactly the reason we have to have it. So you may all raise your hands if you're dreading Thanksgiving, but it's time to talk about these hard things. You might disagree with what's that?
Comments and disappear. So,
all right. So thank you to all of you for being here tonight with me at my dining room table. And I hope I say some things that make you think, that maybe unsettle you a little bit. And I just want to thank you for listening with open minds, open hearts, and I think we're going to have a great conversation. Two of the influences you'll hear coming through tonight in what I'm saying are my background as a native Hawaiian. If you, Jeremy mentioned that because he and I are both children of Hawaii, and if you want to hear more about that, you can watch our conversation from last night. So there's that, and there's also the acknowledgement, of course, that I see the world through a Christian lens. I'm a Christian minister, and this is the faith framework from which I'm speaking. I sure hope there are people of other faiths with us tonight, or no faith, but I just want to own my own bias, so you guys know that. And finally, I am going to talk a lot, and it's weird because I'm talking to a screen and we can't interact as we would in person. It's like in preaching class where they make you practice in the mirror. It's the most horrible thing. So help me make this as conversational as possible. Please, please comment along the way as you watch. If you want to send an anonymous comment, you can send a Facebook message to Circular Church, and Jeremy's going to moderate our conversation when my remarks are over. So please hang in there with me. Even though I can't see you, I believe you're out there engaging these issues with me. So thank you for being here. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. So tonight we're going to try to think about what happens when God gets political. Obviously, that means that I am entering this conversation with the premise that God indeed does get political. And I'm going to try tonight to take us through a few examples of the biblical witness that will offer a glimpse of God certainly, definitely getting political. This is all to say that if you do not believe personally that God cares about politics, well, then you and I might have to circle back and have an offline conversation later, because there is no question in my mind as I come to these thoughts tonight that the divine cares deeply about the way that we order our corporate life, which is in fact the definition of politics, right? So the modern English word politics or political comes from a Greek word that means something like of, for, or relating to citizens. I would venture to say that at this moment in history in America, you and I are watching a political landscape in which politics does not mean of, for, or relating to citizens, but something more like the cynical and often cruel pursuit of influence and power over other people. But for the sake of this conversation, the definition of politics boils down to this very simple definition. It's how we order our corporate life, the decisions that we make about how we live in shared community. It's clear that God has some thoughts on this because we see in scripture over and over again that God is deeply, deeply invested in the state of our human life together. So when we talk about what happens when God gets political, we're not talking about the politics we see on CNN or even likely on the debate stage tonight, but we're rather talking about God chiming in to offer an opinion on matters of, for, or relating to citizens. That is the state of our corporate life. You can start to get the impression that God is interested in our corporate life as early as, well, the very beginning, right? Creation stories and brothers fighting and killing each other, and God announcing to Abram that God is about to build a great nation. But if you have any doubt about the divine's interest in our life together, just turn your Bible to the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus for concrete, literally, that's a joke, and I hope all of you are laughing, proof of God's investment. That's when the Hebrews were wandering in the desert, getting into all kinds of disagreements, and God handed over the 10 Commandments written in stone, right? Sort of cliff notes for how to live in community. You would think that 10 rules written in stone would just solve all the problems once and for all, right? Well, wrong. Skip ahead a few thousand years to the disaster Israel, the country, created, then to a monarchy that failed to solve their problems, then to a huge split into two different countries, all the way through that intrigue until you get to the books of the Bible that tell the stories and messages of the prophets. So biblical prophets were individuals that God singled out and asked to go to the people in power and to warn them that their policies and principles for common life were headed toward disaster. Many of you know Walter Brueggemann, the amazing Old Testament scholar. His definition for prophet reads this way: prophets are called by God to have impact on persons, to impinge upon perception and awareness, to intrude upon public policy, and to evoke faithful and transformed behavior. How do you like that for a job description? There are many, many in the biblical witness who showed up to challenge the people on how they were living their life together. But tonight, I'd like to briefly remind you of two whose stories illustrate God seriously getting political. First, the prophet Amos. So Amos never wanted to be a prophet. He would have been perfect as an intern of mine, because I always say, don't ever be a minister unless you can't do anything else. But Amos was very happy in his life being a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees, living in the southern kingdom of Judah. I mean, who would really want the job of challenging corrupt systems? You can get into a lot of trouble by doing that. Believe me. By the time Amos was preaching, the national split had already created two separate monarchies, right? Judah to the south and Israel to the north. So instead of God's people having one corrupt and inept king, they now had two. The people had all but abandoned the laws of Yahweh, who had brought them out of slavery in Egypt and handed them the fundamental guidelines by which their common life should be ordered. In short, love God and love your neighbor. Well, Amos had a dream. God came to him and asked him to cross the border from the south into the north and to send the people a message. And even though he did what God asked him to do, nobody was listening. I mean, like, he is up there giving an important message, and the fabric of society is just unraveling all around him. The text says that the poor were getting poorer, and those with power were gobbling up everything they could with greed, eliminating even traditional safety nets that were part of Jewish culture. I'm holding up a plumb line in the midst of my people. Amos said on behalf of God, a leveling tool. Something is crooked here. Something is terribly, terribly wrong. You have to fix it. It's urgent. So Amos kept talking and nobody was listening. So his next message was even more severe. This time it wasn't a plea to be kind to each other or even to start acting with fairness and justice. He said, "The Lord appeared to me and asked me, Amos, what do you see?" And I saw a basket of summer fruit. Then the Lord said to me, "The end has come upon my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The songs of the temple will become wailings, and I will say, be silent." God was done making suggestions, in other words. Now you might wonder what a basket of summer fruit has to do with God reaching God's limit. The original Hebrew in the text is a pun. It's a play on words. The Hebrew word used here in this text was pronounced differently in Judah, the south, and Israel, the north. So something like this. In the south, where Amos was from, the word was pronounced kai-itz, which means summer fruit. In the north, where Amos was preaching, the word was pronounced kates, which meant the end. Amos was now telling the people that this was the end of the road. God wasn't interested anymore in begging them to turn around and care for their common life. It was clear that they wouldn't. Talk about getting political. This was it. God was done with these people who wouldn't care for each other, done with the perpetual choosing of power over justice, done with the poor being trampled and the vulnerable cast aside, and done with the hate-filled way they kept on treating each other. These ways of living our corporate life are not God's ways. God was getting political, and God couldn't have been clearer. And then there was Hosea. Remember him? Hosea was a contemporary of Amos's, but he had a much longer tenure in the prophetic field. He was actually from the northern kingdom of Israel. Hosea was preaching in the context of the same outrageous social conditions that Amos railed against too. The exploitation of the poor, growing income disparity, the turning of the people away from Yahweh toward whatever they felt like and however they could get ahead, and the people using religion for political gain. Things like that. Any of these sound familiar? Things had gone from bad to worse. God was like sick of the people and their perpetual evil. And he was about ready to look elsewhere for justice-making partners because, as we know from reading the biblical witness, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, and God will never be deterred from God's dream for humanity, ever. And so, even though it didn't seem like anybody was listening, the prophets kept preaching. Hosea is labeled by one commentator as the tabloid prophet because he didn't preach his message as much as live it, with a life that could give the Kardashians a run for their money. Little something to make people sit up and take note. You know, a scandal. As the story goes, the Lord commanded Hosea to take a wife who made her living as a prostitute. So he hired a woman, he married a woman named Gomer, and they had 3 children. Now, the intricacies of the Hebrew text here are considerable, and we modern readers don't really know the full meaning of the story. For example, scholars are uncertain whether Gomer was a prostitute in the way that desperate women would turn to the oldest profession in the world to take care of their families, or she could have been a cult prostitute who served at the temple, or she was just somebody who was perpetually unfaithful. It doesn't matter though, because anybody who listened to Hosea preach could hear the message of his life. Like Hosea's unfaithful wife, the people of Israel betrayed Yahweh again and again and again, and they ended up in the same place that the people who were listening to Amos did. That would be on God's last nerve. And we know this because the tabloid prophet Hosea's life gets even more interesting. He has 3 children, maybe his, maybe not, whom God instructs him to name Jezreel, Lo-ruhamah, and Lo-ami. Now, I told you that I grew up in Hawaii, and in the culture where I grew up, the naming of a child is very serious business. Traditionally, this is how it goes. The grandparents will talk with an elder in the community to consult on a few names that they think might be appropriate. And usually it's the grandparents who name the child. Some of the questions they'll ask themselves as they're deciding are like, what are our hopes for this child's life? What message do we want to send the world about the values of our family when we name this child? What characteristics do we think that the world needs from this child? What is the unique message of this child's life? It's like serious business, right? And it seems like there might have been a similar situation in ancient Israel, but in the case of Hosea's children, their names had terrible connotations. Jezreel, Hosea's first son, was named after a city in which a horrible tragedy had unfolded. It would be like naming your kid Sandy Hook or Columbine or even Charleston. Hosea's second child, a daughter, was given the name Lo-ruhamah, which meant not pitied or not cherished. It's based on the Hebrew word for womb, and it's used to talk about the deep bond between mother and unborn child, in this case, completely broken. And the third child, a son, was named Lo-ami, which meant not my people, like God's final and utter rejection of the Hebrew people again. Using Hosea's life, God was sending the message, you have been repeatedly unfaithful to me. Your actions have resulted in devastation. Our relationship is broken. And in fact, the hurt and betrayal are so deep that we are finished. You cannot read the witness of the prophets and tell me that God doesn't get political. God is insanely political. And that continues into the Christian additions to the Holy Text when we meet Jesus, the one whom we claim to follow as Christians, the one who represents the word and witness of God in the world. Now, I'm just going to say it straight. We'll talk more about this tomorrow night. But we modern, especially American Christians, like to claim our witness by establishing very clear, non-negotiable rules that are like a litmus test for whether you make the cut or not, right? So forget about the basic principles of the 10 Commandments. We like rules about who you marry, or what you decide to do with your own body, or whether or not you think that I should be able to own my very own AK-47. Jesus in life and words sent a message just like the prophets. And guess what? It wasn't any one of those. Jesus was born very poor in a manger to a manual laborer. His childhood was spent fleeing as an immigrant. As an adult, he was itinerant. He talked about not having a place to lay his head, and he talked all the time about money. 11 of his 39 parables are actually about money, and this has colored the way that we Christians live in community. It influences our politics. Everything from the prosperity gospel to ascetics who live with nothing to their names. We've tried all kinds of gymnastics to line up how we want to live with what Jesus had to say about how we distribute our material wealth. Yes, Jesus did talk about money a lot, and he was poor. But what he was asking us to do in every teaching he gave was far more political than just a commentary on what we do with what we have. Jesus wants us to be about creating the kind of whole society that reflects God's best hopes for the world, the whole entire world. He called this idea the kingdom of God, and he preached about it all the time. It's a place where we understand at the very deepest level of who we are, that my thriving depends on your thriving. It's a place where we understand it's the holy calling of being human to care for our neighbors, especially those who are vulnerable, and that it is, listen to me here, an act of faith to challenge systems and policies and leaders who build and manage our corporate life in ways that do not reflect love for God, the source of our being, and love for our neighbors. It's an act of faith. And this message that Jesus was preaching wasn't very popular. Why? Well, because to create the kind of community that God imagines for us, you have to care about other people before you care about yourself. You're ready to give up things like power, position, prestige, money. You give up the notion that what we have is based on what we deserve rather than what we need to thrive. You do things like wear a mask because you're protecting the health of other people. Things like that. And like the prophets, Jesus paid a price too, the ultimate price. He made people so mad that they killed him. The message was that threatening. Oh, believe me, God gets political. You could say that one of God's foremost concerns is how we order our corporate life, politics. So I fully admit that this case I've tried to make tonight, God's intense concern for our corporate life and God's resulting disgust with how we choose to live, may not be the most hopeful place to end tonight. So I'll share this. Way back in the day, when I was a young and energetic new minister in my first ever church staff job, I was given the assignment to plan all the midweek services for the season of Lent. 7 weeks, super exciting. Every Wednesday night, the church would hold a little service in the chapel that was in the education wing of the building. So I got busy planning the series. I think the series had a title chosen to reflect the somber nature and the spirit of confession that should always characterize Christian practice during the season of Lent. It was probably something like barren, or arid, or desolate, or something suitably dramatic. Any of you who know me will know that it was surely dramatic. I planned the decor in the chapel to match the trajectory of Lent. So every week the lights would go lower and lower, and the room would look more somber, and it would be draped in dark fabric, for example. all the way until we got to Holy Week, by which time we were so depressed we wouldn't be able to wait for Easter to come. That was my plan. So in order to make the space look desolate, I laid sand all over the place, and I decided we would need a big dead branch, which I happened to find in the city park near the church. And with considerable trouble, I tied it to the top of my minivan and I carried it to church, where I stuck it in a bucket of sand and I installed it at the front of the chapel for very extra dramatic effect. I do know that my boss thought I was crazy, but you know, I'm always committed to innovation and trying new things. So all Lent, that branch sat in the front of the chapel. Each week it was draped in fabric and lit increasingly ominously. And if you ask me, it worked great as a visual metaphor for the desolate nature of the season of Lent. And everything was great until about week 5, when I walked into the chapel to make sure that everything was ready for worship. And I noticed on the branch a couple of green leaves, like on the dead branch, growing. So this was a serious impediment to my visual display of desolation. So I hurriedly covered the leaves with some more dark fabric, and I crossed my fingers that no one would notice. And then every week it got worse. Unfortunately, by Holy Week, the lowest, most depressing week of the Christian year, there were leaves sprouting everywhere on that dead branch. So many shoots that there was no way that I could cover them up. Now, do not ask me how a seemingly dead and dried out branch in a bucket of sand in a dark room came to life again. I do not know. I do know that it ruined my Lenten decor. I always remember that branch, and I think of it like God's perpetual apocalypse when God deals with us and our politics. When God throws up God's hand at the stubborn refusal of human beings to live the kind of shared life that God hopes for us all. The terrible metaphor, for example, of Hosea's family that reaches its end in chapter 1, verse 9, with the birth and naming of Hosea's third child, reads this: "The Lord said, name him Lo-ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." That's it. We're done. Apocalypse. But God always seems to be a God of endless grace, because the story does not, in fact, end there. It's almost like God says, let's pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and keep trying, keep at it. With God, you see, rebirth always happens at the very place where it seems like death has the final word. I didn't make this up. It's the fundamental metaphor of the Christian faith. Resurrection. That's where God always shows up. After God announcing that he was done with his people by naming Hosea's child this terrible name, the text reads, Yet the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which can neither be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, you are children of the living God. Now, in a moment, we'll have some conversation about what I've been talking about tonight. I encourage you to chime in the comments, and Jeremy's going to guide the conversation based on your thoughts. But let me end tonight with this. Well, there are some in the world who will never get on board with God's political platform. It doesn't matter. When God gets political, God will demand a high standard and God will not compromise. His patience will run out, and we can govern ourselves straight into disaster. But God's deepest hope for all of us is always this: that we live together in a way that reflects our non-negotiable mutual dependence, where justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And doesn't that sound amazing? Doesn't that sound almost worth giving up everything you have to make it happen? I hope it does, because I really think that that is our calling if we want to be followers of God in the world. God's deepest hope, God's deepest concern is for the way that we order our corporate life. And just to put you on notice, that concern impacts us if we want to say we're followers. So tomorrow night, we're going to talk about what happens when we get political, how care for the way that we order our corporate life is in fact walking in the way of the divine. Getting political is an act of faith. Thanks for listening to me tonight, everyone. I'm looking forward to conversation, and I hope you're commenting and participating in the comments. And Jeremy, I'm looking forward to having you back in the conversation and taking this a little further. Thanks for having me here.
Thanks for being with us, Amy, and thanks others for joining us. Excuse me, I am toggling between screens, and I'm going to do my best to moderate and keep the discussion going. So if you are with us on Facebook, I can see the Circular Church Facebook screen. I'm not sure Amy can, because she and I are on Zoom. So if you were to send comments or post them in the comments section, questions is really what I'm getting at. And then I will do my best to relay them, and we'll have a nice conversation together. I have seen some of you who are commenting where you're looking in from, and excuse me, I have a dry throat. I know that people are tuning in, friends from Oregon and Texas and North Carolina, and certainly here in South Carolina.
That's
so
awesome. Hi, everybody.
Friends who are clergy in the Unitarian Universalist Association, other friends who are Baptists and Congregationalists. And this is just a quick scan, but it's good to see so many of you. So I know there are good questions. So in fact, I see one now coming in. And so, and the question is, Amy, if you could speak a little more about what you mean by corporate life within the church. And corporate, I think for this person may have, business-like connotations, or, the Fortune 500 kind of association, but maybe just a little bit more about that or clarification.
Sure. Thank you for that question. When I say corporate, I mean our communal life, like how we live in community. And I was trying to approach it from a sort of bird's eye view tonight, because when God was commenting through the voices of the prophets, God was not distinguishing certain groups of people. It was like the society, the whole society that was headed toward disaster. But for those of us who lead communities of faith or participate in communities of faith, I really think that where we need to take this is to an understanding of corporate that brings it down to our little community, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow night. But I like to think of our life and faith community as sort of like a practice round for what we do in the world, right? And so that means that the work that we do to build our corporate life as communities of faith is extra, extra important because it's where we learn how to be good citizens. It also means that when we screw things up, which we do all the time, anything that we have to offer the larger conversation about how we live our whole corporate life doesn't have any power. So when we screw up our congregational lives, we're participating in a kind of malpractice that goes far beyond our own congregation. It says to the world, this dream that God has for the world doesn't have any relevance for us. And to me, that's sin. That's deeply sinful.
I can only say amen.
What do you think, Jeremy?
I'm just, that resonates. I mean, everyone I know who has been in church life and as a lay person in leadership or as a clergy person has deep wounds from that. And I'm always interested in how do we actually put into practice types of confession and forgiveness and reconciliation within our own community. And it's, and I want that for the larger world too, but you brought up a difficult truth that I think probably is not talked about enough, about how communities of faith harm each other. And when we do, I've also been reading a lot of James Baldwin. When we do, how do we really tell the truths that we're afraid to tell? And go ahead.
Right. And again, we'll go more deeply into this tomorrow night because, our understanding of Christianity is so embedded with American culture. But I think for so long, the church has been reactive in our corporate life. So we look outside the doors and we see what's going on in the world and we think, oh, we want to be cool kids too. We're going to do what they're doing, right? But when God gets political, God wants us to set a new standard, to be creating from within something that is subversive and riddled with justice and stands in contrast to the world around us. And then to get it out there. I mean, that's like two completely different ways of viewing corporate life, right?
Can I ask you a follow-up that is coming from me? I mean, not,
Sure.
and I'm marking down, don't worry, I'm marking down other questions, friends, and they're coming next. But I've wondered for a long time too about the role of humor and humility in what we're doing, starting as maybe communities of faith, but then also in our public life. And I want to be quick with this, but what drew me to a lot of the Hebrew narratives was the portrayal of God. God was so often exasperated and angry and frustrated and just couldn't take it anymore. And sounds like most of my friends right now, just God was always, pacing around.
Like go to timeout. Yeah. Yeah.
It made sense. It was a very human portrait. It was very sympathetic, like the frustrations I understood. And it struck me funny. I thought it was funny. And sometimes
maybe pastors feel that way sometime too.
I think, yeah, but I think church folk feel that way. I mean, citizens feel that way. And I just wonder about the role of humor, especially starting with the church, for example, the times when we really harm each other. And that is not funny, but having the humility to say, we've done it. Now we've really got to do something differently or make amends or just, it's a very emotive, some of those.
Yes, and it's dangerous and it's beautiful, right?
Yeah, and I guess I wonder what holds us back from doing that, both in our smaller communities of faith, and in our families, things that are very close, and then in our public life together, we seem.
I'm scared of being vulnerable, of letting you see who I really am, because you might hurt me.
Scared. That's just something to take in for a minute. And it might be connected to something that someone else was wondering about. It's a tender and vulnerable question, but she had asked, where do you see, little sprigs of new life and in this desolate moment, sort of alluding to the story that you told, or do you see them emerging in different places?
Yeah, the saying that change is hard is kind of overused, but it's so deeply true. It's so hard individually, and it's especially hard institutionally and communally, corporately. And, the church has not had to change. I mean, we could just be who we are forever and ever. And, to hell with it. We just won't change. And anybody who has been part of a community of faith and hoped for, prophetic justice witness knows that it's hard to get people, to change the hymnal, much less, be a prophetic witness. The great news is the sprigs of hope are, we are, if we're not there yet, we're almost to the point where we don't have a choice. It's change or die. The institutional church in America is in decline, and it's gonna take leaders who are willing to not be the cool kids on the block, to say, all right, you've got yourself in this situation, here are the consequences. How are we gonna move forward? And sometimes that change will never happen until you're desperate enough. We're in this moment of desperation, and that's, I think, where the hope is.
Well, and I'm arranging a couple of questions together so that they move in a kind of flow, I hope. One friend who is one of the happiest and most soulful people I know is wondering about also making our justice work pleasurable and joyful and inviting, and full of life. And I wonder if you have thoughts on how to infuse it with something something more alive.
Well, I don't think this dream that God had for our shared life was meant to be drudgery or pain. It's like God is pulling God's hair out to say, like, if you build this kind of community where you know what you believe and you live it with courage and abandon together, where you care about your neighbor more than you care about yourself, oh my gosh, that's like a little glimpse of heaven, right? This is the opportunity that we have to build healthy communities that give us so much courage and joy, that get us through life. We think of drudgery and pain because we're not living the politics of God. You could also have a dunking booth for the pastor.
Yeah, that never gets old. And, well, and to follow up a little from the same friend, about how we might emphasize the divine feminine more as well as a part of that, or other ideas you might have related to.
I wrote an article for Religion News Service that I put up again on social media today about why it's important that Kamala Harris is the vice president nominee. And I talked in that article about the leadership of women and why it's so critically important. And you mentioned, Hawaiian culture being matriarchal. And this, of course, is not all women and all men, but in general, an approach that is is concerned and caring about the way the community functions, not sort of who's winning, who has the power, who can I beat down, and who can I raise up. It's just two completely different ways of viewing the world. And of course, again, not all women lead in that way, but so far in our human existence, we've done a lot of killing and dominating and trying to have power. And that is going right alongside the fact that women have not been leaders. So maybe we've been missing 50% of the input that we need to build these kind of communities. So put women in leadership, teach your daughters that they need to be leaders, show the world that you're making a place for the voices of women. And if you say that's what you want to do, follow up with the way you live your corporate life. Pay women the same as you pay men. Give women the same job titles that you give men. Don't let us work in situations where we're subject to sexual harassment. There's a lot of work that we have to do.
Amen. And this is a difficult question that was sent in, and I wonder, I even hear it differently, imagining more women in our political leadership and in our public lives together. But the question was essentially about Jesus' identity as a Palestinian Jew, and why, how did we get to such an intractable kind of either or between Israel or Palestine, or, so many American Christians in particular taking a side there, but not showing empathy for both sides or for all people. And it was, it seems like an age-old question at this point, but.
Well, if we pull back from that a little bit, there are two issues here that we could really go very deeply into. And one of them is, why don't we live our lives like Jesus did in all the ways? How do we get the prosperity gospel out of what Jesus, taught us? So, that's one really critical conversation that I think we need to have. And I would encourage, you in your communities to facilitate these conversations. Let's ask ourselves, why don't we live like Jesus taught us to live? The other question that I think is so critical, and again, we'll talk about this tomorrow, is how have we gotten to this place where Christian faith is so enmeshed with American culture that we can't even draw any distinguishing lines? That's egregiously wrong. And in order to parse through all of that, we're going to have to do some hard looking in the mirror about what's cultural and what isn't. And then some of us are going to diverge on this road, right? Some of us are going to be like, I prefer the padded pews and the, everybody, packed into church. I don't prefer to be preaching a message where I'm going to get killed. It's going to happen.
Yeah, I wonder also where Christian faith is so embedded and Christian bias is so embedded in much of American culture, certainly Southern culture where we are here in Charleston, but it's also deeply embedded in our politics in South Carolina, and every politician invokes it. All of them.
I have to confess to you, I'm looking up her name because I have tried to forget it, but she is running for Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's running for Congress, I believe, in your state. Is that right?
I don't know. I'm not sure that she's
Georgia. She's running for Congress in Georgia. So I follow her on Twitter because I work really hard to not just reinforce the way that I think about the world. I want to hear what other people are thinking. And I'm daily baffled at the way that she understands Christian faith. It's so enmeshed with culture, and happens. It's not just her, it's all kinds of politicians. And I think for those of us who are willing to take the words and witness of Jesus seriously to the point of personal pain, we're going to need to take some risks to get political. And again, we'll talk about this tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering too, aloud to you, everybody who's listening, you know, about how to keep the way of our faith. And I want to honor all faiths here. How to keep the way of our faiths from being co-opted by those who will mix in some scripture and some hymn and some spiritual, but the politics don't match.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but the poor get poorer, and police brutality gets worse, and inequality rises, and people get evicted. So, but there's all this veneer of religion, and so I just want to raise that up. That's a real challenge where we live. I think it may well be in Washington as well.
Well, I'll just say this, you know, progressives have been terrible at talking about faith, terrible at talking about faith. And that's sort of related to, you know, I don't want to offend you, separation of church and state, all of that. But I think that's wrong, because I think our faith is an important lens by which we see the world. And it gives heft to what we're saying about the policies that need to be in place.
And I think for some of us, before we move to the next question, some of those stories of faith, you know, the Jesus stories, for many of us who grew up in the Christian tradition, they shaped our moral imaginations. So we heard the story of the Good Samaritan, and it informed the way we saw the world. You know, we heard the story of, we heard teachings like, you know, forgive others 70 times 7, or put away your sword, or thing, and it shaped the way we saw things. And I think I love it when more of those ideas are raised. But those are fundamental challenges to the status quo. I mean, nobody else is saying, "Hey, I'm running for office because I'd like us to put down our swords." You know? But I'd like to hold on to that tension. Speaking of which, another friend asks if you could share a little bit about how to hold the God of politics in the way that you were describing our political engagement with the God as character as portrayed in the book of Job.
Nothing like a little softball there.
Question, it's from a minister, you know how it is. Dear friend.
Well, that'll be another lecture series. No. I think the answer is somewhere, and help me here, Jeremy, in what you brought up about how when we talk about God getting political, we see like human characteristics of God, you know? And in seeing those, maybe it's another invitation for us to grapple with our own humanity, which is what I would say about the book of Job. But what we talked about tonight about God, like throwing up God's hands in exasperation, you know, that's not about God. That's about us. That's about us and the way that we choose to respond to the divine imperative. So that's about all I got. What do you have?
Well, I'm always happy to say what I don't know. But there's so much ambiguity in Job for me, especially about the God character and the framing of the story. Some of it, frankly, is troublesome to me. I mean, it troubles me, but I read that more than anything as a story of Job's attempt to understand his own suffering, and in some ways our attempts. And to me, at least, I read it more pastorally. And the only political thing I can make of it that is authentic for me is, the idea of putting ashes on our head and mourning and being sort of gutted by loss. And so I read it in many ways as a lament.
Because being human is hard and painful.
Right. And if we were, I don't know, the Job story, I'm still a little puzzled about the God character in Job. But the Job story would suggest that we should all be weeping in the street for more than 200,000 who have died here, hundreds of thousands around the world, that we should stop glossing over that and feel it, bear witness to it. So I get it. If any of you are in Charleston, our dear poet laureate Marjorie Wentworth wrote a poem called 100,000 Names. And we put the poem on a banner and hung it out on our wrought iron fence for everyone to see in an attempt to do this. And that was a political statement,
yes,
of lament and grief. And we can't say all of their names, but we can bear witness to what is happening. So if you are passing through Charleston, stop by and read that poem.
Wow, I want to know more about that. I think these two things, like human life is hard and our faith demands that we get political. Those should be held together. I said in my remarks tonight that we need to change the way we think about things, not to do you deserve what you have, and rather, do you have what you need to thrive? Because it's when we don't that we have so much pain.
And I might just echo that and add, I think we want to bear witness to the suffering and to grieve. But then if we ground ourselves in it in a certain way, in the lived experience of people, then we get to do liberation theology. Then if we're remembering people's lived experience and how people are suffering, what people need, and we ground ourselves there, I feel like maybe our politics are coming from a deeper place.
And that gets us sort of to the conversation of, how do you change people's minds? I mean, how do you even have a conversation with someone who's so entrenched in another way of thinking? That's again, tomorrow night.
Well, and it's, we can save it for tomorrow night. And in fact, thank you, one of our staff members has posted the poem on our website in the comments, so you can read it. One friend has asked, or when you shared that you were following someone who thinks in different ways and trying to get a sense of her, but she said it was very difficult for her to listen to women who she felt did not support other women, and kept other women in certain roles, perhaps, or and she asked how you were able to do that.
I don't find it easy or tasteful in any way, shape, or form. And I think we have to be honest about how in American society, white women have surrendered a lot of moral ground in order to keep the power that we get from attaching ourselves to men. And that's just true. Donald Trump is in the White House because of white women. And it's a true hard thing, the way I do it is that I live with my daughter who's African American, and she reminds me every day. Today I was playing a Dixie Chicks video and she said, I'm just over it. I don't want to hear what white women have to say. And I think there's some element of repentance there. And so for me, in order to keep myself on the straight and narrow, I have to listen to those hard voices. So I'm sure that I'm keeping myself in check. Even though, you know, it kills me to call myself a white woman, but I show up in the world as a white woman.
Thanks. Well, and I don't even know where to start with white men. So I'll just encourage us to audit our reading lists and our music lists and the preachers we listen to and the public officials. Just, I feel like I'm, as a white man, I had wonderful women ethicists who taught me, and Black teachers who taught me, edit what's coming in. You know, if the list doesn't look like the world, then you're not getting it. So that's just possibly a starting place. Sorry, I didn't mean to start with white men, because I don't really know where to. It's a big subject and a big problem.
Yep. And when we think about how we get political, there are all these systems of bias that are built into our society that we need to start waking up and looking at, and that's one of them.
Well, and I'll ask a question too along the topic of whiteness. Not too long ago, I was listening to a webinar between Eddie Glaude and Ibram Kendi, and out of that dialogue came the idea that for those of us who are white, that our work should be to move from being white people to becoming people who happen to be white. And what was said about that was that white people are invested in the benefits of whiteness. But we're hoping to come to a place where we can reject those benefits and privileges. We don't want them. We want something better, and we want to ground ourselves not in our whiteness, but in our personhood.
But can we actually do that? I mean, it's really good to go to protests and to, you know, read the good books and to be in the discussion groups, but like, God invites us to live in a way that rejects our own privilege. And there's not a lot of people who want to do that. Like, I don't want to do that, you know? So the call to God's politics is so much more difficult if we're really honest about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the question you're asking, can we really do that? Move from being grounded on our privileges to being grounded in something else. We all want to say, sure, we can. I think, but if we're really honest, once this is over and we all click off and go, you know, I don't know what we do after this, have a cup of tea and sit in the chair and think, you know, that's a deeper question of identity. What would it take to become a person who is white, happens to be?
In a little teeny way, COVID has exposed this for America as a country. Like, a very simple question: can you care about your neighbor more than you care about yourself? If your answer to that is, but I have a right not to wear a mask, then you're in effect saying, no, I cannot, or I will not. And it's so interesting that we're being challenged in a very, very easy way. And in many cases, we're failing the challenge.
I just think
I think I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing about your own perspective, being someone who, you know, is at risk if I show up without a mask, you know?
Sure, I've been really public about it, including the front page article in the newspaper. So, and certainly the church is more than kind and understanding. But for those who don't know, I have an autoimmune disease and it affects my lungs. It manifests itself in a kind of lung disease. And the medication I take for that suppresses my immune system even further. So something like COVID, coronavirus it's a respiratory virus, is really the worst possible thing for me. And so I've been more or less in a bubble since March and doing church and most things from home, and with a lot more birding than I ever imagined as a way of getting out. But it's very strange where I live because not many people wear masks still, and so it's been a time when I've been made to feel much more vulnerable. And honestly, before this happened, I could pass for healthy. Because if you didn't know, you can't see my lungs, you don't know. But once this happened, I needed to become a little more public about my vulnerability. And I think I've shared this with you before, Amy. When I shared with people how vulnerable I was, and a number of them, public officials or others, didn't really care. My immediate thought was sitting with Black friends who have so often said, I'm vulnerable to the police. And people have said, oh, you're making too big a deal about that, or it doesn't really matter, or, discounted. And I think it's just part of my introduction to a long pattern of not caring much about the vulnerable. And there are many types of vulnerability. So now we're right back to what you said. I don't want to make myself vulnerable because you might hurt me. And I think there's something, if we were putting into practice God's politics, for lack of a better term, we would care for each other in that vulnerability.
Yeah.
Then maybe we could even become people who happen to be white. We wouldn't have to be invested in these structures of harm that might protect some of us and hurt everybody else, and we could do something else. But now, I'm sorry, I got a little preachy on us.
No, thanks for sharing your story. It was very moving the first time you told me about how vulnerable you feel,
Yeah. And this time also, I just think it can help us to imagine, because I was afraid and really concerned for myself for about a half a day. And after about a half a day, I started to think of everybody else in the church who I knew had cancer, or who had a lung condition, or who had a risk factor, or who lived with someone who did. And I started to think of others in the larger community. It's really so many of us. And if it helps us to see each other differently, or to see each other better, I think that part would be good. I'm looking also to see if there are other comments. I'm going to make sure. Now
it's so strange to be having a larger conversation, but it's not. There's nobody there. I miss all of you.
Me too. It is, honestly, a little easier when you can see who's raising their hand for the microphone. Yeah, and my dear friend Fu, who was actually my best man, who lives in Houston, was just talking about how still some people are referring to this virus as the China virus, the kind of bigotry that's still being introduced. And almost to take this thing that is happening to us all or affecting us all, and we could use it to expand our imaginations in a very beautiful way on the one hand, or just to make it even worse, I don't know if you could.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example of how we practically reject the kind of corporate life that destroys us. When we refuse to listen to that kind of language. Anything that we do or say that creates an us versus them does not support that non-negotiable mutuality that I talked about. God wants us to remember that we belong to each other. That when I make you into something other, it's so much easier for me to disregard you and not see you as the human being you are, created in the image of God. So that's wrong. And I don't want to hear that language around me at all. It's wrong. I feel strongly about this.
And it's Amy, it's just such a good example, and your public voice is such a good example of just saying what's wrong and just naming it. And I think, especially for progressives who again are not very good with religion so often, I think finding our voices there, and I don't have any way to quantify this, but I think more and more progressives are finding our voices.
Yes, I think so, for sure. But I can remember even when I went to Riverside, I had a colleague who helped me with communications who would say, would you just talk about Jesus? That's who you are. You are a Christian minister. So say, as a follower of Jesus, calling this virus the China virus is completely unacceptable. That way, we're not arguing about what this verse says about this, but me as a follower of Jesus, this is what's informing the way I'm behaving.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, like, what would happen if we got into these conversations with people and said, well, as a follower of Jesus, I would.
Right.
That would be wild.
It would be great.
It would be great.
And yeah, I'm just thinking of so many things, but one thing that might be helpful, one thing that really clarified things for me was doing doctoral work at a Unitarian Universalist seminary, where nobody had any assumptions. There was great freedom of conscience and great respect, and so we started every class, and you'd have to say who you were and where you were coming from, what your resources were, what your culture and traditions were, and to me it was completely liberating not to be in a room full of Christians who were all making assumptions. I could just say, I'm coming from this place, and this is my understanding of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, and here's how I'm trying to apply them. And people were genuinely interested. And
that's so amazing. And I think because of our hesitance or inability or worry that we're not being polite enough to say things like that, we have ceded Christian faith in our culture to completely different voice. So it's going to take us saying, as a follower of Jesus.
Right. And I would just encourage anyone who's out there too. I think it can still be more difficult sometimes when we are in rooms full of Christians who are making assumptions, to then differentiate or to disagree or to raise our voices in a different way in that crowd. So that's it. It's hard work.
Yes. It's hard and holy work. It's holy work.
And it was hard for Jesus too. So it's okay to remember that, I guess.
I mean, if your faith isn't going to mean anything in your life, then just don't waste your time. I mean, there are other things you could be doing, right?
I don't know. What about if you had a really nice church and you could get dressed up and go to it and have brunch?
Yeah, well, we can't have brunch anymore, so that's off the table. And if that church won't change, it's not going to be there for very long. So
unless, I'm sorry, I have to
there's
say,
an endowment.
Unless it's in Charleston, in which case not changing will guarantee that it can stay.
Well, it's going to take some Christians who say, as a follower of Jesus, exactly, and then bring the change, right?
And yeah, and I'm being a little playful. I mean, the culture where we are, again, there are many, many churches. There are some that I think are deeply enmeshed in culture and politics. And there are also a great number of Christian churches and houses of other faiths that are extraordinary and prophetic.
So, yes, and don't take all of it on yourself. I mean, some of the most self-proclaimed progressive communities in our country can't act like that. So, yeah, it's what you do, not what you say, right?
Yeah, and yeah, I can only say amen to that too. I know, so, but there are good people around, and I'm encouraged to think of more people finding their voices, and every place from the block walkers in our neighborhood to the Poor People's Campaign. I've and here I don't feel like this is progressive or conservative. I don't really care what it is. When people are raising their voice on behalf of the poor, on behalf of their neighbors, on behalf of the earth and of the generations coming after, to me, that's just a deep humanity, and that's just love. I don't know. It's political, but I'm not sure we need to label it in the convenient terms of American discourse. It's not. It's better than just being American.
I'll just tell you a quick story. I know we're getting ready to wind down here, but I happened to be in a park with a friend, and an older man came over and started talking to us because he noticed my t-shirt, which said something about women being president. It was a little Elizabeth Warren t-shirt, to be just honest. But anyway, that's what girls do, or whatever it said. And he said, I can see by your t-shirt that we probably don't agree politically. And we got into just a conversation about our lives and what we were thinking. And he mentioned something about having to wait a long time to get his stimulus check. And my friend who was with me said, wow, that sounds like, do you really need that money? You seem like you have a lot of money. And he said, actually, I do have a lot of money, and I don't really, now that you mention it, I don't really need that money. And my friend said, can you think of somebody in your life who could use that money more than you? And I swear to you, that guy was like, the guy who does my yard could probably use that money more than me. I'm just going to give it to him. It was like this beautiful moment. And I think those are more sprouts of hope, right?
Yeah. And what courage to ask the question, do you really need the money?
Yeah, that wasn't me. That was my friend.
Giving your friend some credit, just that's.
Yeah, it was. I was impressed.
And it's really a question of imagination.
Yes.
In many ways. So, well, would you like to give us a preview or a send-off for what we can look forward to tomorrow?
Yes. So we're gonna now leave this place and go take a break and then either go watch the debate or go do something fun. But I've titled my remarks for tomorrow, When We Get Political. So I've tried to make the case tonight that God has very deep thoughts about how we live our life together. And so the end result of that, in my mind, is the next conversation, which means if we want to live in this world as followers of this God who gets political, what does that mean for us practically? You know, we'll be talking about everything from human biology, the way your brain works, to how hard it is to be a leader in the church in this moment and to risk everything, to some actual specific things that we can do to get political in the way of God.
Wow, I can't wait. So, and I can't wait not only for tomorrow, but just for where it leads all of us.
Yes.
So,
thanks for making space for this conversation. I'm really grateful.
Me too. And thanks everyone for joining us and for asking such wonderful questions and being part of the conversation. So we're doing our best with the technology. It's all love. We're trying, and we look forward to seeing each other again tomorrow. So if you'd like to share this video, it will appear on our YouTube channel later on. I'm not exactly sure. We hope tonight. And then also tomorrow we'll gather again for a live stream on the Circular Church Facebook site at 7 p.m. And we'll also put that on YouTube afterwards too. So please join us, share with others you think might benefit, and invite them to join us too. And again, special thanks to you, Amy, and I wish everyone good evening and aloha from here.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.